A photograph meant to preserve a memory ended up exposing a truth everyone wished had stayed buried. The year was 1895, and Willowridge lay tucked between old forests and rolling meadows like a secret the world had forgotten to uncover. It was the kind of town where roofs creaked, streets stayed empty after sunset, and secrets traveled faster than the wind. Everything in Willowridge felt heavy, heavy with silence, heavy with unspoken truths, heavy with something no one wanted to name. And yet on that cold November morning, even the silence felt different. The cemetery, Willowridge's oldest landmark, sat on the highest hill. Rusted iron gates guarded its entrance, each bar twisted like old bone. The stones were crooked, half buried, some unreadable. The fog drifted low, moving between graves like pale hands brushing against the earth. Anyone with sense avoided the place. Even the priest visited only in daylight. But on that gray, windless morning, a small crowd walked up the hill toward the freshly dug grave of Thomas Harkin. Their steps were slow, deliberate, some out of respect, some out of fear, and some out of curiosity. For the Harkins were not just any family. They had known more sorrow in 10 years than most Willowridge families saw in entire lifetimes. At the center of the gathering was Elena Harkin, a young widow, though she looked older that day. Grief had carved faint lines under her eyes, and her black mourning veil fluttered weakly in the cold. She stood stiffly, as if holding herself together with sheer will. Beside her stood Owen, her 8-year-old son. He wrapped his small fingers around her hand, gripping her as tightly as if he feared the earth itself might pull her away from him too. The priest's voice was low and steady as he recited the final prayers. The murmurs of amen floated through the air, thin and brittle. A few townsfolk stayed for a moment, offering their condolences, but none lingered long. Thomas's death had been sudden, too sudden, and whispers had already begun circulating about what truly happened. Some claimed his heart simply gave up. Others believed darker things, but no one dared speak openly, not yet. When the last of the mourners walked away, leaving Elena and Owen alone beside the grave, the fog seemed to thicken around them. The quiet was overwhelming. "Mama," Owen whispered, tugging her sleeve, "is Papa really gone?" Elena knelt and placed both hands on his cheeks, tears already forming in her eyes. "Yes, my love," she whispered. "He's gone to a place where he feels no pain." Owen nodded, though a child can never fully understand grief, only its shadows. Footsteps approached behind them. Elena turned to see Mr. Callahan, the town photographer, climbing the hill with difficulty, his heavy wooden camera strapped over his shoulder. He was a thin, elderly man with silver hair and a habit of staring too long at things, as though he could see truth in every shadow. "I'm sorry to come now, Mrs. Harkin," he said, slightly out of breath, "but young Owen visited my shop yesterday. He asked me to take a memorial photograph." Elena looked at her son in surprise. "Owen," he stared at the ground. I wanted us to have something, so I don't forget what Papa looked like. I don't want to forget." Those words, innocent, heartbreaking, struck Elena harder than the funeral itself. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Of course," she whispered, "a picture would be good." Mr. Callahan set up his equipment beside the grave. He worked slowly, carefully, as if afraid he might disturb the dead themselves. The wind paused, as though holding its breath. "Stand here," he instructed gently. Owen stood to Elena's left. She placed her hand over his shoulder, steadying him. Her other hand clutched a small, wilted flower she intended to place on the grave when the photo was done. The fog curled low around their feet. Even the trees seemed to lean in as the lens glinted under the gray sky. Callahan stepped behind the black cloth draped over the camera. "Hold still," he called softly. Just before he clicked the shutter, something strange happened. Elena felt a feather-light sensation, a soft brush on her right shoulder, almost like the touch of a child's hand. She flinched, but when she turned, no one was there. Owen hadn't moved. The cemetery was empty. "Are you all right, Mrs. Harkin?" Callahan asked. "Yes," she whispered, though her breath trembled. "Just the cold." He nodded. "Very well. On 3, 1, 2. A sudden gust rushed through the trees, sharp as a knife, yet carrying no leaves. No sound, nothing but a chill that felt too alive. 3. The shutter snapped, a moment stolen from time, a moment they would one day regret capturing. After the photograph, Elena placed the wilted flower on the grave. She whispered a final goodbye and led Owen down the hill, not realizing that the cemetery watched them leave with a silence that felt too aware. 2 days later, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the town, a knock echoed at Eleanor's door. She opened it to find Mr. Callahan standing there, clutching a small envelope. His face was pale, as though he had seen something unnatural. "Mrs. Hawken," he said, voice trembling, May I come inside?" Eleanor frowned. "Of course." He stepped in and removed his hat, wringing it in his hands like a man trying to still his nerves. "I developed your photograph," he said, already. Eleanor asked, "Thank you. Owen will be pleased." Callahan's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Harkin, I need you to look at it carefully." A cold shiver ran through Eleanor, though the room was warm. She took the envelope and slid out the photograph. The moment she saw it, her breath caught. There she was, standing beside her husband's grave, Owen by her side. Her face looked as exhausted as she remembered, and Owen's eyes were wide, filled with sorrow. But there, on her right shoulder, was a hand, a small, delicate hand, a child's hand. Eleanor's heart stopped. Her legs weakened, the world around her dimmed to a blur. Her voice cracked like breaking glass. "Mr. Callahan, who is this?" He shook his head. "No one was behind you. No child was anywhere near that grave. I saw everything, I swear to you. That hand wasn't there." Owen, hearing their voices, ran from the kitchen. "Mama, what happened?" Eleanor knelt, her hands trembling as she held the photograph toward him. "Owen, do you see it?" He looked, his face drained of color. That's a little girl's hand." He whispered, "Yes." Eleanor breathed, "It is. But Mama, no one touched you that day." Eleanor stared at the hand. Every detail of it was unmistakable. The slender fingers, the faint curve of the knuckles, the softness only a child's hand had. A hand she knew, a hand she had held through sleepless nights and laughter and tiny joys. A hand she had buried, her daughter's hand, Lily's hand. Tears blurred her vision. Lily, who had died 7 years ago at age 4. Lily, whose death had never made sense. Lily, whose body had been covered in mysterious bruises Eleanor had never been given answers for. Lily, whose name Thomas had rarely spoken after her burial. Lily, who was now in the photograph. Owen took a step back, fear in his eyes. "Mama, is Lily trying to talk to us?" Eleanor tried to speak, but her lips trembled too badly. She looked at Callahan, hoping he would offer some explanation, any explanation. But he only shook his head slowly. "I've been taking photographs for 30 years, he said quietly. "I've seen light tricks, glares, reflections, but this is none of those. Mrs. Harkin, you must be careful. Whatever this is, it's not normal." Eleanor pressed the photograph to her chest, as if holding it close would somehow bring her daughter back to her. But beneath the grief, beneath the shock, a strange realization crept in. Lily was reaching out, not to haunt them, not to frighten them, but to tell them something buried, something hidden. Something that had been waiting 7 years to emerge. The room was silent, but Eleanor felt it. The air shifting, the walls closing in, the weight of a truth pressing against her soul. She whispered, barely audible, "Lily, my baby, what are you trying to show me?" In that moment, a faint breeze brushed past her cheek, though every window was shut. It felt like a small hand, warm, gentle, familiar. Owen gasped, "Mama, did you feel that?" Eleanor nodded. Callahan stepped back, fear tightening his face. "Mrs. Hawken, forgive me for saying this, but whatever touched you, whatever appeared in that photo, it may not be done yet." Eleanor clutched Owen's hand, holding him close. Her heart pounded painfully, but her voice grew steadier than before. "Then we will face whatever comes," she said. "We lost Lily once, but I won't ignore her again." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat beside the fireplace, the flickering glow reflecting off the photograph on her lap. She traced the small hand with her finger, tears running silently down her cheeks. Somewhere in the house, a faint creak echoed, like the sound of a child's footstep. She turned, heart racing, but saw nothing. Only the shadows shifting against the walls. She whispered into the darkness, "Lily, my love, if you are here, show me, help me understand." The fire sputtered, the room chilled, and for a single heartbeat, Eleanor felt a presence behind her, a feeling she hadn't felt in 7 long years. It was not cold, it was not frightening, it was her daughter. The warmth vanished quickly, but Elena knew without doubt that Lily's spirit had reached out for a reason, and Elena would uncover that reason, even if it meant unraveling the past she had tried so desperately to bury. As the clock struck midnight, Elena stared again at the photograph, at the hand that shouldn't exist, at the secret it promised, and for the first time in her life she felt afraid, not of ghosts, not of death, but of the truth Lily wanted her to see. The chapter of her life she thought had ended was only just beginning. Willowridge woke slowly the next morning, as though the entire town had spent the night wrestling with uneasy dreams. Fog still clung to the streets, curling between horse carts and chimney smoke like something alive. Doors opened hesitantly. People stepped outside with stiff shoulders, glancing around as if expecting something, or someone to be watching, and in many ways something was. The whisper about the Harkin photograph had already begun spreading like wildfire, quiet at first, then growing louder with each retelling. By sunrise, it traveled from the baker's shop to the post office, from the schoolhouse to the church. A ghost appeared in their picture. Some said no, others whispered it wasn't just any ghost, it was her dead daughter. Poor Elena, first she loses Lily, then her husband, now this. God protect that woman, something follows her family. The judgment in their voices was sharp, cruel, but coated with the sweetness of curiosity. Willowridge had always loved its mysteries. It simply did not like facing its own. Elena tried to ignore the noise. She tried to ignore the stares she felt when she walked into town for groceries, but every whisper cut deeper than she admitted. She held Owen's hand tightly as they walked along the cobbled street. Owen stayed close, his small eyes darting around nervously. He had barely slept the night before. Elena had heard him whimpering in his dreams, calling out for Lily, a sister he barely remembered, yet one whose presence he felt so strongly now. The photograph weighed in Eleanor's pocket like a stone, as though the little hand resting in it anchored her to a truth she had run from for 7 years. She did not want to be afraid. She wanted answers. And answers rarely waited in silence. When they reached the town doctor's office, the bell above the door chimed with a shaky clang. Dr. Alden looked up from his desk, startled. "Mrs. Harkin," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "you're here early. Is everything all right with Owen?" "It's not about Owen," she said quietly. "It's about Lily." The doctor's face went white. He motioned for her to close the door. Owen sat on a wooden bench while Elena stepped closer to the doctor, lowering her voice. "Something strange happened," she began. "At Thomas's funeral, a photograph was taken. When it was developed, someone appeared." Dr. Alden swallowed. "Who?" Elena met his eyes. "Lily." He flinched so visibly that Elena stepped back. "You knew something," she whispered. "You always did." "I knew nothing." He snapped too quickly. "Lily died of fever. You know that." "No," Elena said softly. "I only know what I was told." The doctor's gaze flickered to the photograph she slowly pulled from her coat. When he saw the image, the small hand on Elena's shoulder, his face contorted with horror so deep it looked decades old. "Burn it," he whispered shakily. "Mrs. Harkin, you must burn that picture, immediately." Elena stared at him, stunned. "Why?" "Some memories," he murmured, "were not meant to return." He refused to speak further. His hands trembled so violently that Elena stepped back, clutching the photograph to her chest. She sensed fear in him, raw, genuine fear. But fear of what? Lily or the truth? She left the clinic with more questions than answers, and the feeling that the doctor's guilt was heavier than his fear. The wind was cold when she reached the edge of town. But she didn't go home, not yet. Instead, she found herself walking toward the cemetery, toward the place Lily had pointed to in her dream. The hill was quiet, too quiet. Not even birds dared to perch on the iron fence. Elena hesitated at the entrance. Owen tugged her hand nervously. "Mama," he whispered, "why are we going back?" "Because Lily wants me to," she said. "She's trying to show us something." Owen's eyes widened. "You think she's here?" "I think she wants to be heard," Elena replied. They walked slowly among the gravestones. The earth felt softer here, older, almost as if it remembered more than the living did. Elinor headed toward the far end of the cemetery, the part she had never visited, the part Lily had pointed to in her dream. The fog grew thicker as they approached the dip in the land. Stones here were cracked, sunken, or missing entirely. A voice behind them startled her. "You shouldn't be here." Elinor spun around. It was Mr. Garrick, the old cemetery caretaker. He had worked there longer than anyone remembered, leaning on a wooden cane with every step. His eyes were clouded with age, but sharp with caution. "This part of the grounds is unsafe," he insisted. "Old land makes for poor footing." Elinor stepped closer. "Mr. Garrick, what is this place?" His lips tightened. "A forgotten place." "Forgotten by who?" He stared at her long and hard, then sighed. "Come with me." He led them a few yards deeper into the neglected section. He stopped beside a crooked stone that was barely legible. "This," he said softly, tapping the stone with his boot, "was once the children's corner." Elinor felt her heart drop. "Children," she whispered, "why are these graves pushed to the edge?" "The town was smaller then," he said. "People were poorer. Records weren't kept well, and some children, they died of sickness." He hesitated. "Others," he whispered, "died of things the town didn't want to speak about." Elinor froze. "What things?" Mr. Garrick's eyes shifted away. "Neglect, abuse, fathers who drank, mothers too sick to care, some little ones simply disappeared." Owen clung tighter to Elinor's skirt. Elinor's heart pounded so loudly it drowned the wind. "You mean someone hurt them?" The caretaker's jaw clenched. "People did terrible things back then, Mrs. Harkin, and the town didn't want its name stained, so they buried the truth along with the children." He looked down at the stone beneath his foot. "Many of these little ones never had their names carved. Some families refused to mark their shame. Some couldn't afford it." He knelt, brushing dirt from another unmarked rock. "Every grave here has a story that Willowridge wanted to forget." Elinor felt her stomach twist. "But why are you telling me this?" He stood slowly, leaning on his cane. "Because your Lily wasn't the only child buried with unanswered questions." Elinor's breath caught. She swallowed hard. What do you mean, Mr.?" Garrick's eyes softened painfully. "Your husband, Thomas. He used to come here." Elinor blinked. "What?" "Yes," the caretaker said. "Late at night, when the town slept, I'd see him walking through these graves, stopping at certain ones, always the unnamed ones, as if he recognized them." Elinor felt like her legs were turning to stone. "Recognize them? That's impossible. Thomas, he didn't know these children." The caretaker sighed deeply. "I thought the same until one night. He fell to his knees right over there and started crying, begging forgiveness." Elinor's arms wrapped around herself as though protecting her heart from shattering. "Forgiveness for what? I don't know," he said. "He never spoke loud enough for me to hear, but he cried like a man who carried a burden so heavy it threatened to crush him." He stepped closer. "And the next day, your Lily died." For several seconds, Elinor forgot how to breathe. Her vision blurred, the world swayed. Those bruises on Lily's body, she was told, were from fever. Thomas insisting the doctor's explanation was correct. Thomas refusing to let her question the cause. Thomas shutting down every time she cried for answers. The cracks in her memory widened like splitting stone. "Mama," Owen whispered, fear trembling in his voice. "Are you okay?" She didn't trust her voice, not yet. She knelt and hugged him tightly. Mr. Garrick rested a hand on her shoulder, a gentle, fatherly gesture. "Mrs. Harkin, sometimes the dead speak because the living refuse to listen." Elinor looked at the trees swaying around them. The branches seemed to whisper. She felt Lily's hand again, a warmth brushing against her shoulder. Lily wanted her to know. Lily needed her to know. Elinor stood, her eyes burning with tears and something stronger, something fierce. "Determination. Mr. Garrick," she said softly, "thank you, but I need to understand everything about this place, everything about my daughter." The old man nodded, though his expression was grave. "Be careful where you search, Mrs. Harkin. The truth sleeps lightly here." As Elinor and Owen walked home through the fog, she couldn't shake the image of Thomas kneeling among the unnamed graves. Why would he visit them? What did he know? What had he done? That night, Elinor couldn't eat, couldn't think of anything but Lily. She sat at the kitchen table long after Owen had fallen asleep, her hands trembling as she unfolded the photograph again. She stared at the tiny hand, the softness of it, the way the fingers curled gently around her shoulder. Lily had always been gentle, a quiet child, a child who rarely cried unless she was in true pain. Elena remembered the night Lily died. Thomas had carried Lily's limp body into their bedroom, claiming she had collapsed from fever. Elena had rushed to the doctor, desperate for help, but Thomas had insisted no one had time to bring him in time. He said she had died quickly, quietly, but now Eleanor's mind replayed things she had ignored, things she had been too grief-stricken to question. Why had Thomas forbade her from preparing Lily's body for burial? Why had he insisted the coffin remain closed? Why did he go pale whenever she asked how Lily fell sick so suddenly? Elena pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Lily," she whispered brokenly, "what did he do to you?" A cold wave drifted through the kitchen. The candle flame flickered, then went out. The room plunged into darkness. Eleanor's breath hitched, and in the silence she heard it. A child's voice, soft, close, familiar. "Mama." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Lily," the voice came again. "Mama, find me." Her heart pounded so fiercely she felt faint. She whispered, "I'm trying, my love, I promise I'm trying." A gentle warmth brushed past her, like small fingers sweeping across her sleeve. Then it vanished. Elena lit the candle again with shaking hands. Lily wasn't haunting her. Lily was begging her, begging for truth, begging for peace. And Elena realized something then, something she wished she had understood 7 years earlier. Children don't reach out from the grave unless the living failed them, and her daughter had been failed. Not by strangers, not by fate, but by someone far closer, someone Elena had trusted with her life, someone who had shared her home, someone who had shared her bed. Thomas. A chill settled over her. Lily had returned for a reason, and the town had kept its silence too long. Tomorrow she would begin digging, not in the earth, in the past, in Thomas's belongings, in the secrets he thought were buried. Because the photograph had woken something old, something restless, and Willowridge was a town full of shadows. Shadows that whispered, shadows that watched, shadows that remembered the truth the living had tried so hard to forget. But Elena wasn't afraid anymore, not of the town, not of Thomas, not even of the dead. She had a daughter to fight for, a voice to honor, a truth to unearth, and she would not rest until Lily did. The sky over Hollow Creek had begun to bruise into shades of purple and fading gold by the time Elena reached the cemetery gate that evening. The old iron bars were cold beneath her fingers, colder than before, as if the ground itself knew she was getting close to the truth it had guarded for far too long. She paused at the threshold. Everything in her wanted to turn back. Everything in the town wanted her to turn back. Even the wind, restless and whispering like an anxious mother, seemed to tug at her coat, urging her to leave the past alone. But Elena had seen the faces in the photograph. She had heard the sorrow behind Ruth Hargrove's trembling voice. She had witnessed the way Mayor Whitlock's eyes hardened whenever the year 1895 was spoken aloud, and inside her chest, something deeper than curiosity, something like duty, pressed her forward. The buried secret was here, and it wanted to be found. The cemetery was empty, though emptiness felt like the wrong word. It was still, too still, like a room holding its breath. Elena walked between rows of headstones, their carved names softened by decades of wind and rain. The trees beyond rustled, but the leaves did not fall. Even nature seemed hesitant to disturb this soil. She clutched the old photograph in her hand, folding its creases like a map. The figures were unmistakable. 5 townspeople, including a young Ruth, standing before a grave that bore no name. But that grave did not match anything in the cemetery, because that grave was missing. It was not misaligned, not relocated, not weathered beyond recognition. It was simply gone. Her heart pounded harder with each step she took. Where did it go? She whispered to herself, but the cemetery, loyal to its dead, refused to answer. She stopped when she reached the Hargrove family plot. The last rays of sunlight touched the stones, casting long, trembling shadows. There were 6 headstones in the line: Samuel Hargrove 1889, Evelyn Hargrove 1894, Thomas Hargrove 1895, Edward Hargrove 1895, Martha Hargrove 1895, Nathaniel Hargrove 1895. Eleanor frowned. 6 stones. But Ruth had said there were 7 children. She knelt, brushing dirt from the dates. 4 siblings had died the same year, and within months of each other. 1895, the year the graveyard photograph was taken. She studied the spacing between the stones. There was a visible gap, about the width of a single grave, between Martha and Nathaniel. Someone should be here. Eleanor whispered. The missing grave, it belonged to a Hargrove child. Ruth had said the name once, briefly, like a secret escaping her lips. Elijah. Eleanor felt the truth tighten around her like a noose. This cemetery had held 7 Hargrove children, but only 6 stones remained. A twig snapped behind her. Eleanor spun, her breath caught in her throat. Who's there? Silence, then another crack of dry wood. She stepped back, sweat beading at her temples despite the cold. I know someone's here. A figure emerged, not from behind a tree, but from the darkness itself. A tall, weathered man, his shoulders stooped and his hands trembling as if every muscle in his body fought to retreat. Sheriff Dawson. He looked older than he had in the day. I told her, defeated and far too haunted for a living man. Miss Eleanor, he said quietly, you shouldn't be out here. She held up the photograph. The paper flapped in the wind like a frightened bird. You knew, she accused. You've known the whole time. The sheriff's jaw worked to form a sentence he didn't want to speak. That's not a picture people should see, he murmured. And that grave was never meant to remain. Her heartbeat thundered against her ribs. Why? Eleanor demanded. Why hide a child's grave? The sheriff closed his eyes, and for a moment, Eleanor feared he might collapse. But then he inhaled long and slow, as if preparing to exhume a truth heavier than any coffin. It wasn't a child's grave, Miss Eleanor. His voice broke. It was a prison. A chill shot across her skin. A prison? She whispered. Yes. He swallowed hard. We didn't bury Elijah Hargrove. We buried what he became. Eleanor shook her head, refusing the implication. Sheriff, he was just a boy. No. Dawson whispered, looking at the darkening sky. No, he wasn't. Not at the end. The sheriff sat heavily on a nearby stone bench, the weight of memory pulling him downward. You want the story? He asked. Then I'll tell you. Eleanor sat across from him, fighting the tremor in her hands. Dawson's voice was hollow as he began. In the winter of 1894, a sickness swept through Hollow Creek. Not a disease, not one any doctor could name. It came suddenly like a shadow passing over the town. Children cried at night. Animals went missing. People claimed to see shapes moving in the woods. Eleanor leaned in, her breath shallow. The Hargrove family was the first to suffer. Dawson continued. 6 of the 7 children died within months. Their deaths were quiet, peaceful even. He looked at the empty space where the 7th grave should have been. But Elijah? Elijah didn't die, he changed. What do you mean changed? Eleanor asked, her voice no more than a tremble. He started hearing things, Dawson whispered. Started speaking languages no one taught him, started showing up in places he couldn't possibly reach. The boy stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped blinking for hours at a time. Eleanor's stomach twisted. One night, he vanished, disappeared from the Hargrove house without a trace. And then, Eleanor whispered. Dawson's voice dropped, and then bodies began appearing in the woods. Not animal bodies, townspeople. Eleanor felt a cold pressure behind her eyes, the weight of the story sinking into her bones. The townsfolk were terrified. Dawson said, they formed a search party. I was only a deputy then, but I was there. We found Elijah near the old creek bed. His voice faltered. What was left of him? Eleanor felt her heart stop. He wasn't a child anymore, Dawson said, shaking. He wasn't human. She swallowed hard. What did you do? We built a grave, Dawson whispered. But he wasn't dead, Miss Eleanor, not completely. We sealed him inside, covered it with stone, blessed it with everything the church had. He pointed toward the space between the Hargrove markers, that grave held for 60 years. Eleanor's pulse hammered in her ears. Held, she repeated. Dawson looked at her with eyes full of nightmares. Yes. Eleanor stood, adrenaline rushing through her. You're telling me something was buried here alive. Something, Dawson confirmed. And it's gone now. Dawson nodded slowly. Graves don't vanish on their own, he said. Only one thing could have removed it. Eleanor shivered. Elijah. The sheriff lowered his head into his hands. Something has been moving in these woods again, he whispered. Animals disappearing, people hearing voices at night. And you think, I don't think, Dawson interrupted. I know. The wind wailed between the stones like a scream muffled by earth. Elijah is back. Eleanor stepped away horrified, but her mind raced with the same burning clarity that had driven her into this cemetery. Why show me this? She demanded. Why now? Dawson lifted his face, eyes dark, hollow, and pleading. Because you've stirred the past, and once the past wakes, it doesn't go back to sleep. The moon rose fully now, pale and enormous, casting silver light over the graves. Eleanor began pacing. This can't be real, she said. Children don't turn into monsters. Graves don't vanish. Dawson did not argue. This town buried a sin, he whispered. A sin so dark it poisoned everything that touched it. He stood, his voice trembling like a frayed rope. And it's coming for us. For a moment neither of them moved. Then a low growl rippled through the air. Not human, not animal, but something in between. Eleanor froze. Dawson's hand fell to the revolver at his hip. Don't move, he breathed. The growl deepened, echoing across the graveyard, vibrating beneath their feet. Eleanor's lungs tightened. From behind the Hargrove plot, a shadow rose, not walking, not crawling, but unfolding, as if the night itself had grown limbs. Dawson whispered a single word, Elijah. Eleanor backed away, her breath a cold fog. The figure stepped forward, moonlight striking its outline. It was tall, taller than any man, limbs elongated, face hidden in darkness, body wrapped in something like roots or decayed cloth. But the eyes were unmistakably human, childlike, tormented. Elijah Hargrove, still 8 years old, still trapped inside the thing Hollow Creek had buried alive. Eleanor's knees threatened to buckle. The creature moved closer, its breath rattling like wind through a coffin. Dawson raised his gun. Don't, Eleanor cried, but he fired. The sound exploded across the cemetery. The figure staggered not from pain, but from memory. Then it turned and vanished into the trees with unnatural speed. The sheriff collapsed back onto the bench, shaking violently. It remembers, he whispered. It remembers what we did to it. Eleanor reached for him. We have to tell the town, she said. We have to warn them. Dawson shook his head. No, the town already knows. He looked at her with hollow, defeated eyes. They've always known. Eleanor's breath broke, so they lied. All of them lied. Dawson laughed bitterly. No, Miss Eleanor, they survived, and they meant to keep surviving. A heavy silence fell. So what do we do now? Eleanor asked. The sheriff looked at her with a mixture of dread and fragile hope. We finish what they started, he whispered. Eleanor swallowed hard. And what exactly is that? Dawson stared into the dark forest where the creature had fled. We put Elijah to rest for good this time. As Eleanor looked again at the empty space between the headstones, she felt the weight of her own role in the unfolding horror. She had brought the photograph back into the light. She had awakened the memory. She had broken the seal of silence around 1895. But another truth began to seep into her mind, cold as the night. Elijah didn't return on his own. Elijah followed something or someone. The photograph, the grave, the timing. She suddenly felt the world tilt. Sheriff, she whispered, what if Elijah wasn't the monster? Dawson looked at her sharply. What are you saying? Eleanor clutched the photograph to her chest. What if Elijah was hiding from something worse? A shadow crossed Dawson's face. What could be worse? He whispered. Eleanor didn't answer, because in that moment she understood the buried secret was not Elijah. The buried secret was what the town had done to him, and now the truth was rising, not just from the grave but from the conscience of Hollow Creek itself. The past was no longer buried, it was walking. And it was coming for all of them. The night air was sharp as broken glass, carrying the distant cries of restless birds fleeing into the sky. The moon hung low, too low, appearing more like a watchful eye than a celestial body. Eleanor felt its cold glare on her back as she followed Sheriff Dawson through the twisting path that led out of the cemetery and toward the forest. The trees stood tall and rigid like silent witnesses, their branches clawing against the dark as if trying to keep something trapped within. The ground was soft beneath Eleanor's boots, damp from the evening frost, and each step sounded like it disturbed a space that had not been walked on in years. Dawson walked ahead sluggishly, his shoulders heavy with a lifetime of secrets. His hand trembled near the holster at his hip, though both of them knew bullets wouldn't solve what was loose in Hollow Creek. Maybe nothing would, but Eleanor had a feeling, not a hope, but a heavy understanding in her bones, that this night was not about killing a monster. It was about uncovering a truth that the town had never dared to speak aloud, and she feared she already knew what that truth was. As they pushed deeper into the woods, Dawson's breath grew labored. "It's close," he whispered. Eleanor scanned the forest. "How can you tell?" "The forest goes quiet when it's near," he responded without turning. Then, with a rueful smile, he added, "Same way it went quiet back in 1895. A shiver rippled down her spine. They reached a small clearing where the moonlight pooled onto the ground like spilled milk. A single tree stood in the center, ancient, twisted, and leafless. It rose like a crooked finger pointing toward the heavens. Elena recognized it immediately. "Ruth told me about this tree," she whispered. "The Hargrove children used to play here." Dawson nodded. "It's also where they first found Elijah after he disappeared. He was sitting with his back against the tree like he was listening to something the wind was telling him." Eleanor approached it slowly. Something about the air felt heavier here, warmer, as though the ground itself remembered footsteps and cries and the trembling breath of a terrified child. She placed her hand against the bark. It pulsed. Just once, like a heartbeat, she jerked away. Before she could speak, another sound tore the night apart, a soft, broken sob. Not human, not animal, something between. Dawson's hand flew to his holster again. "Stay behind me." But Eleanor stepped past him. "No," she said quietly, "it's not after us." She could feel it now, deep, aching grief, a loneliness that dug into her chest as if it belonged to her. "Elijah," she whispered. The sound of her voice stirred the shadows, and then a figure emerged from the darkness. Elijah stood at the edge of the clearing. His thin body shuddered under layers of torn cloth and twisted roots. Moonlight revealed skin as pale as the grave and limbs too long for any child. But the eyes were unmistakably human, wide, fearful, exhausted, and beneath the terror, Eleanor saw something else. Recognition. He stepped forward, trembling like a wounded animal. Dawson raised the gun. Eleanor shoved his arm down with surprising force. "No, Eleanor, it's dangerous. He's a child," she insisted. "No," Dawson whispered. "He hasn't been a child for decades." But Eleanor didn't move away. She took one step closer. "Elijah," she said softly, "I saw your photograph. I know you've been alone for a long time." The creature flinched at the sound of his name as though it hurt to remember who he once was. Eleanor swallowed hard. "I won't hurt you." Elijah's head tilted, his bony fingers curled and uncurled, and then he spoke. His voice was barely sound, like leaves scraping stone, but it carried unimaginable sorrow. Mother." The word cut through Eleanor like a blade of frost. Dawson let out a strangled cry. "No, no, he can't." But Elijah stepped forward again, reaching out with shaking hands. Elena didn't move away. "You remember her," she whispered, "your mother." At that, Elijah's entire body convulsed, as though the memory of love was too painful to hold. Tears, or something like them, welled in his glowing eyes. "Mother, promise," he whispered. Mother said, "I won't leave you." Eleanor felt her throat burn. "She didn't leave you," she said quietly. "They took you away." Elijah jerked violently, opening his mouth in a silent scream. The trees bent inward as if reacting to his pain. Dawson stumbled backward. "He's losing control, Eleanor, move." But she shook her head. "No, he doesn't want to hurt anyone. He wants the truth." Elijah lifted his face toward the moon, his chest heaving, his body trembling with rage and grief. Then from somewhere behind him a voice cracked the night. "That's enough, Elijah." Eleanor spun, her heart nearly failed. An elderly woman stepped into the clearing, frail, white-haired, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. Her face was lined with time, with pain, and with the weight of a secret carried for far too long. "Ruth Hargrove," Eleanor gasped. "Mrs. Hargrove, how did you find us?" Ruth smiled sadly. "I've known this place longer than anyone alive." Dawson stepped forward. "Ruth, you shouldn't be here." "Oh, I've been waiting 60 years to be exactly here," Ruth said. She looked at Elijah. Her breath trembled, her eyes wavered, her heart broke all over again. "Elijah," she whispered. "My baby?" The creature shivered violently. "Mother, mother." Ruth dropped her cane and fell to her knees, arms open. "My sweet boy, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." Elijah let out a sound that cracked the world, something between a sob and a howl. It carried every night he spent alone under the dead earth, every moment of fear, every confusion, every betrayal. He moved to her slowly, so slowly Elinor thought he might collapse. And when he finally reached her, he sank into her arms like a child. Ruth held him, stroked his tangled hair, and cried into his shoulder. "My promise," she whispered through tears. "I told you I wouldn't leave, and you thought I did, but they took you from me, Elijah. They hid the truth from me, and from you." Elijah's voice shook like brittle twigs. "I know, my darling." Ruth kissed his forehead gently. "I know." Ruth turned to Elinor and Dawson. "You want to know the real secret," she said. Dawson stiffened. "Ruth, don't. I will not die with their lies," she snapped. Her voice carried a lifetime of fury. Elijah wasn't the danger, he was the warning. Elinor felt her pulse throb in her ears. "What do you mean?" Ruth wiped her tears. "The sickness that killed my children. It wasn't illness, it was poison." Elinor stared. "Poison?" Ruth nodded. The mayor at the time had struck a deal with an out-of-town company. Chemical runoff seeped into our water. Babies died. Children died. Elijah survived. But the poison twisted his mind, his body, trapped him between life and death. Dawson fell silent. Ruth continued. "They blamed him, called him cursed, a monster." Her voice shook, but the real monsters were the men who signed those papers. Elijah whimpered, clinging tighter to her. Ruth cupped his cheeks. "You didn't kill anyone, Elijah. You were sick, confused, and they feared what they had created." Elinor felt her vision blur. "They buried him alive," Ruth whispered, "to hide their crime." Dawson finally spoke. "I tried to stop them," he said, his voice cracking. "I was young, I had no power, and afterward, they threatened everyone. Anyone who spoke the truth vanished." Ruth nodded. "So Hollow Creek buried more than a child. It buried its guilt." Elijah trembled violently. His breath grew ragged, his limbs shaking as the weight of the truth tortured him. "Mother, don't leave again." Ruth held his face in her hands. "I won't." The forest began to shake. The wind roared, the moon flickered behind clouds. Elijah's body pulsed with a strange light, soft at first, then growing. Elinor stepped back. "Is he?" Ruth's tears fell faster. "He's dying," she whispered. The only thing keeping him alive was the lie he was trapped inside. Elijah clung to her desperately. "Cold, mother, so cold." Ruth kissed his forehead. "You won't be cold anymore." The light intensified, white and warm, spreading through the clearing like dawn. Elijah looked up at her one last time. "Promise." Her voice cracked with a love deeper than life. "I promise, you're safe now." Elijah's body softened, shrinking, folding inward, and for one fleeting moment, he looked like the child he had once been. Then the light burst silently, and he was gone. Nothing remained but a soft shimmer in the air, and Ruth's trembling hands reaching for a child who no longer needed saving. The first rays of morning broke through the trees just as Ruth collapsed into Elinor's arms. "He's free," Ruth whispered. "My boy is finally free." Elinor held her tightly. Dawson knelt at their side, tears streaking down his weathered face. "Hollow Creek has to know the truth," Elinor said softly. Ruth shook her head. "No, Hollow Creek has known the truth for 60 years. Elinor frowned. "Then why survival?" Ruth whispered. "Fear, shame. They tried to bury it all, but secrets, they don't stay buried." Elinor looked at the rising sun. "What will happen now?" Ruth smiled weakly. "Now," she said, "the town gets a chance to be human again." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in decades, Hollow Creek breathed. Later that morning, as Elinor walked out of the forest, she felt a strange serenity settle over her. The photograph in her pocket felt lighter, not because the secrets were gone, but because they had finally been spoken. She looked back one last time at the silent woods. "Rest now, Elijah," she whispered. The wind stirred gently, as if thanking her. Elinor turned toward the road, ready to face the town, ready to speak the truth everyone had been too afraid to say. And somewhere, deep in the forest, a mother's final promise echoed softly through the trees. "You're safe now."